Violet and Xander slowly descended the stairs together, responding to the call of their mother, Ursula. There, in the hall, stood a man with a suitcase, someone they both could hardly tolerate. "Violet, Xander, please welcome David," Ursula said excitedly. "As I've mentioned before, he will now be part of our family." "Mom," Violet replied with disdain, "you haven't even finalized your divorce from Dad yet." "Well, fortunately, the divorce will be final soon," her mother responded firmly, clearly displeased that her children didn't share her enthusiasm. "Don't you think this is a bit inappropriate?" Violet wasn't backing down. "Violet!" Ursula snapped angrily at her daughter. "Is that his car?" Xander asked dismissively, eyeing the familiar vehicle parked in the driveway. "I thought you said this guy was successful." "Dad bought himself a Mercedes SUV, top of the line." "That's pretty impressive." "Good to see you again, kids," David said awkwardly after Xander's not-so-flattering comparison to their father. "Yeah, I'm planning to change cars too. I'm expecting a promotion at work, so soon we'll have that opportunity." Neither Violet nor Xander looked impressed. A tense silence hung in the air. "Welcome to our home, David." Ursula hissed at her children, furious at their rudeness. "Yeah, sure, whatever," Violet responded coldly, heading upstairs. "They just need a little time to adjust," Ursula reassured a visibly upset David. "I'll talk to them. They'll come around." 16-year-old Violet and 12-year-old Xander had learned about their parents' divorce 6 months prior, when they were informed about their mother's infidelity. It came after 2 years of watching their parents argue and witnessing their mother grow distant from their father, Gary, often speaking to him with contempt. She would use any excuse to be away for days at a time, weekends and holidays spent with her friends, trips to visit family, and so on. Eventually, even the children stopped believing her. It pained them to see their father losing his self-respect as he desperately tried to save the marriage. Their parents had sought marriage counseling, but David was always lurking in the background. When Ursula wasn't home, they could hear their father crying at night. After 2 years, Gary finally broke. He found evidence of her affair just before filing for divorce and blamed David. Both parents sat down with their children to explain why they were separating. Xander cried, while Violet stared at her mother with thinly veiled hostility. Ursula avoided eye contact with the children, feeling awkward. She tried to place equal blame on her husband, but it didn't work. No one believed her. All she could offer was the fact that she had fallen in love with someone else. What followed were 3 agonizing months while Gary searched for a place to stay. Ursula felt relieved once he moved out. In reality, this didn't make life at home any more pleasant. Both Violet and Xander were furious with their mother, who was too absorbed with David to notice. As soon as the divorce proceedings began after Gary moved out, things became bitter, as the love between Gary and Ursula was completely gone. Gary filed for full custody of the children and the house. Ursula resisted and demanded increased child support, the house, for which Gary was still expected to pay the mortgage, and control over the father's visitation with the children. It took 6 months to finalize the divorce. The judge's ruling, delivered without emotion, left everyone dissatisfied. Gary had to continue paying his half of the mortgage until Ursula remarried, if she ever did, along with child support. Custody was complicated by the age difference between the children. Violet was considered old enough to choose which parent to live with, but Xander was not. It was decided that Xander would stay in the family home with Ursula during the week and spend weekends with his father. Violet reluctantly agreed to do the same for her brother's sake. She broke down in tears in her father's arms when she told him about her decision. Gary, also with tears in his eyes, told his daughter how proud he was of her for caring so much about her brother. The parents' divorce brought Violet and Xander closer, especially since Violet had to take care of her brother while their mother continued her relationship with David. A month after the divorce, Ursula invited Violet and Xander to dinner to officially meet David for the first time. It didn't take long for the children to figure out what kind of person David was. Violet, Xander, this is David, the man I'm seeing, Ursula said proudly, holding David's hand. You mean the guy you cheated on Dad with? Violet smirked. Xander slumped in his chair, crossing his arms and turning away sullenly. Violet! Ursula barked, glancing around to see if anyone overheard her daughter's words. It's okay, Ursula, David said with an awkward smile, though Violet's disdainful honesty clearly bothered him. I wish your mom and I had met under different circumstances, but when you get older, you'll understand that love doesn't always work the way you want it to. Yeah, Dad learned that the hard way, Violet responded. David's face briefly flashed with anger, and Ursula struggled to hide her own fury. Xander, I heard you're quite the baseball player, David said cheerfully, trying to change the subject. Yeah, I'm okay, Xander muttered, refusing to look at him. Maybe we could play a game together sometime, David suggested with a smile. Ursula eagerly chimed in, that would be wonderful, wouldn't it, Xander? Thank you, David. Nah, was all Xander said. David and Ursula's smiles faded. The atmosphere at the table grew tense with Violet's hostility, Xander's gloom, David's disappointment, and Ursula's barely contained anger. The rest of the meal was eaten in silence, and both children declined dessert, eager to leave. That was incredibly rude of you. Ursula snapped at the children as they drove home. David tried really hard to get to know you better, and you publicly disrespected him. I don't like him, Xander said from the back seat. I can't believe you left Dad for him, Violet added. Dad is so much better in every way. Ursula wiped away a tear, looking clearly upset. If you just give him a chance, you'll love him as much as I do. He's such a wonderful person. Neither Violet nor Xander responded. When they got home, Violet and Xander immediately went to their rooms, leaving their mother in tears as she called David to apologize for the children's behavior. Dad, you can't let this go. Violet cried in frustration as she told her father about the meeting with David. You have to tell Mom that we don't want anything to do with him. No, I'm not thrilled about it either, Gary answered irritably, before shifting to a calmer tone to soothe his daughter. But this day was bound to come. There's nothing I can do unless he harms you. I think you'll have to see him much more often. Unfortunately, that's your mother's decision. Gary's instincts were right. Ursula convinced herself that the more time Violet and Xander spent with David, the sooner they would come to love him. It was obvious to her, David was a wonderful person, and the kids would understand that in time. David started coming over for dinner and staying the night. Despite his efforts, their communication remained minimal. He bought them gifts, which were carelessly thrown away after he left. Ursula would find the unopened boxes in the trash. Ursula even invited David's parents over, referring to them as Violet and Xander's step-grandparents. Much to her disappointment, and to the bewilderment of David's parents, Violet and Xander still refused to engage with them. Violet, Xander, I need to talk to you, Ursula said firmly. Inside, she was boiling with frustration. Their behavior was unacceptable. She had tried so hard to involve David in their lives, but they constantly rejected him. She was convinced that Gary was encouraging them to act this way. I need to understand why you are treating David like this. He's been kind to you, but neither of you gives him a chance. Why is that? Is your father telling you to behave this way? Dad said this is your problem, not his. He doesn't care, Violet replied sharply. Anyway, we don't like David because of what he did to Dad. I can't believe you're forcing him on us. Violet, David and I are in a relationship, and you need to accept that, Ursula responded, irritated. He's going to be a part of your life, whether you like it or not. Ursula immediately regretted saying it in that tone. So, you are forcing us. Violet had voiced the very thing Ursula feared. No one is forcing you to do anything. David is going to be part of our family. I just want you to accept him. Let him make you as happy as he makes me, she said, almost pleading. That's exactly what it sounds like, you're forcing him on us. You need to accept that we don't like him and never will. And what about you, Xander? Do you not like David either? Ursula asked reproachfully. Xander just slowly shook his head in disgust. I just don't want to know him. Ursula couldn't understand her children. Why were they acting this way? She felt irritated and frustrated. It was even affecting her relationship with David. They could only be intimate on weekends, when Violet and Xander were with their father. Ironically, things seemed easier when she was still married and secretly seeing David. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that Gary was behind all of this. After the conversation with the children, she made sure that Gary could see David every time he picked up or dropped off the kids. She wanted him to see that she, David, and the kids were a happy family, and that he couldn't come between them. At first, she was pleased to notice that seeing David made Gary uncomfortable, but eventually, Gary started to look happier and more relaxed. Out of spite, she once tried to send David to pick up the kids, but they refused to get into his car. Gary took them home instead. All Ursula could hope for was for David to move in with them. He was far more reluctant than she had expected. Despite the issues with the children, she thought everything between them was going well. And so here they were. David stood at the front door with his suitcase and belongings in his dull car, and once again, Violet and Xander had insulted him, while Ursula tried to comfort him. If Ursula thought that David moving in would make Violet and Xander accept him, she was gravely mistaken. The already tense atmosphere in the house only got worse. Violet and Xander refused to engage with David. Mealtimes were spent in silence. When David tried to speak to them, Violet and Xander would sit quietly until he stopped talking. Suggestions to play with Xander were rejected, and when David offered to teach Violet how to drive, she curtly replied, "Dad is teaching me." Any attempts to integrate David into the family were ignored. Whenever Violet and Xander were forced to act like a family with David involved, nothing good came of it. It didn't take long for David to start complaining, even suggesting that Violet and Xander spend more time with their father. A furious Ursula confronted Gary when he came to pick up the kids from their former home. "Gary, you need to talk to the kids about how they're treating David," she said angrily. "Stop turning them against him." "And what exactly do you want me to do?" Gary shrugged. "You brought that jerk into their lives, not me. I know this is your doing. You need to stop, or I'll go to court and cut off all access to Xander and Violet." "You're delusional." Gary laughed in disbelief. "You cheated on me with him, and now you're complaining that they won't accept your boyfriend. Maybe relationships built on infidelity aren't such a great idea after all. Violet and Xander are good kids, and they know right from wrong. They can form their own opinions. They don't need me to tell them anything. They're old enough to decide for themselves. What's happening between them and David is not my problem." Ursula shot an angry look at her ex-husband and stormed back into the house. The attempt to take a vacation only succeeded because Violet and Xander were away, leaving Ursula and David alone. This gave their weakening relationship a needed boost. Gary's indifference to David and Ursula's relationship soon became apparent. During dinner, after Gary dropped off the kids, Violet and Xander excitedly talked about Callie, Gary's new girlfriend. She had shown up at Gary's place unannounced while he was away on a business trip, and the kids were home alone. The unexpected meeting went surprisingly well. Gary, excited, rushed back to see how his kids and girlfriend were getting along. After answering a few awkward questions and assuring them that Callie already knew about them and how his marriage had ended, and after explaining that Callie made him happy, the children hugged her. Ursula felt like screaming with rage as she listened. They had barely said David's name after nearly 6 months of trying, yet after just one unplanned meeting, they embraced their father's new girlfriend with open arms. Despite all the difficulties, Ursula was determined to prove that her relationship with David was successful. Her use of social media increased dramatically. She posted pictures of her and David hugging and smiling, telling the world how lucky she was. There were also photos with the kids, pictures of David attending their events, Xander's baseball games, and Violet's soccer matches. She was desperately trying to paint David as a loving stepfather. Xander's birthday became a point of contention. She hosted his birthday party at their home, putting a lot of effort and expense into it. Not only were Xander's friends invited, but also their parents, siblings, and even David's family. Ursula referred to David's nephews as Xander and Violet's cousins. To Ursula's great disappointment, Xander insisted that Gary be invited too, and Gary insisted on contributing to the party. Xander had a great time. So did Violet, who knew many of the older siblings of Xander's friends. The problem was Gary. Ursula was excited to introduce David to all the parents of Xander's friends, but Gary had known them for years, and they were all eager to catch up with him. David was being pushed further into the background in his own home. Ursula's children remained distant toward David's entire family. Xander completely ignored David and refused to take a picture with him. Xander spent a lot of time with his father, and people at the party began to notice. In Ursula's eyes, Gary was ruining the party she had worked so hard to organize. But then David did the most surprising thing. He got down on one knee and proposed to Ursula, presenting a ring she had no idea he had bought. A stunned Ursula couldn't believe it and burst into tears of joy. The proposal brought applause, she was sure of it. It truly was the happiest day of her life. She insisted they take a picture together, the four of them. If there were any negative comments, she didn't hear them. She, David, Violet, and Xander were about to officially become a family. If Violet and Xander had any objections to Ursula marrying David, they didn't show it. It seemed like this was the best move David could have made. Their attitude toward him changed. They started talking to him, spending time with him alone, and even smiling in his presence. The tense atmosphere of the last few months had vanished. Ursula finally felt that they were the family she had dreamed of since she first met David. In her delusion, Ursula saw no reason to delay the wedding. It was planned for the start of the children's summer vacation so that Gary could take the kids while she and David went on their honeymoon. She wanted the wedding to happen as soon as the divorce was finalized. The only thing dampening her enthusiasm was Gary's lack of interest. All she got from him was a detached "congratulations" and a shrug. He really was useless. Divorcing him was the best decision she had ever made. Everything leading up to the wedding was perfect. The preparations went smoothly. All the invited guests accepted. The wedding day itself was sunny and warm. It seemed like nothing could go wrong. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Ursula noticed a change in the children. She couldn't quite figure out what it was. They seemed nervously excited, as if they couldn't wait for something to happen. She assumed it was because of the wedding and the quickly approaching summer break. That made sense. The wedding was a grand event, and the kids were set to play important roles. Ursula had wanted her father to walk her down the aisle, but although her parents were attending, they didn't like David. Well, in that case, Xander would walk her down the aisle, and Violet was to be her bridesmaid. Ursula enjoyed shopping for wedding dresses with Violet. Xander seemed happy to buy a suit with David for the occasion. The wedding was set to take place at a nearby lakeside resort hotel. The grounds were beautiful and perfect for photos. Ursula was more excited than she had ever been in her life. During the wedding rehearsal, Ursula noticed that Violet and Xander were only smiling at each other. It was as if they were planning something, and throughout the entire rehearsal, the happiness they had shown in the previous months seemed to vanish. They refused to smile and appeared uninterested in what was happening. They had to be reminded several times to follow instructions correctly. They constantly whispered and laughed together, making the whole rehearsal difficult. Ursula could feel her anger rising, but then David unexpectedly came to their defense. "Relax, they're just kids. They're probably excited or nervous," he said. David was, of course, right. Violet and Xander had fully accepted him by now, so why would they act out? The wedding day started beautifully. Ursula and Violet went to get their hair, nails, and makeup done. Mother and daughter together, looking stunning. The catering arrived on time, as did the flowers. But just before the ceremony, things started to go wrong. Xander went missing. Violet went to find her brother and didn't return. Ursula paced in front of the hotel's small chapel. All the guests were inside, waiting. David was waiting. Where were the kids? She couldn't get married without them. Where have you been? She asked angrily when they finally returned. Xander, where's your boutonniere? Xander looked down and smirked. I must have left it in the room. Violet stifled a laugh. This isn't funny. Ursula snapped furiously. Xander, go get it, right now, she yelled. Xander, looking shocked, turned and ran back to the room. Ursula was starting to feel stressed. Everything had been perfect up until now, and she wasn't about to let anything go wrong. The officiant slipped out of the chapel to check if everything was okay. My son just forgot his boutonniere, she laughed, rolling her eyes playfully. Kids. But inside, she wasn't laughing. 15 minutes later, Xander returned with the boutonniere in hand. Ursula pinned it on him herself. She adjusted his tie and fastened the top button of his suit. Honestly, Xander, you're 13. You should be able to dress yourself, she said irritably. Try to stay like this for the rest of the day. She took Xander's hand and forced a smile on her face. All right, Violet, let's go. Violet opened the chapel door and led her mother and brother down the aisle. In her nervousness, Ursula didn't notice that Violet and Xander weren't smiling. As Ursula reached the end of the aisle, she smiled at David with a happy, excited grin, mouthing the word "hi" to him. She kissed both children, who then sat at the front. The siblings began whispering to each other until the officiant, conducting the wedding ceremony, cleared his throat and gave them a stern look, which caused a chuckle from everyone in the chapel. The officiant began the wedding ceremony. He talked about how radiant Ursula looked, what a happy day it was for Ursula and David, and how lucky Violet and Xander were to have David joining their family. Both Ursula and David smiled at Violet and Xander in response to his words. The children sweetly smiled back. Then friends stood up and spoke about how wonderful a couple Ursula and David were and how perfect they were for each other. Any stress Ursula had been feeling faded as she was enveloped in happiness. Before the vows were exchanged, the officiant announced, and now, by the laws of the state, I must ask if anyone objects to the union of Ursula and David. A silence fell over the room. There were one or two nervous chuckles, but then, suddenly, Violet and Xander jumped up from their seats and shouted in unison. We object. Ursula spun around, staring at her children in horror. The officiant nearly took a step back in surprise, and the guests gasped loudly several times. David just stared straight ahead, slowly shaking his head and laughing in disbelief. Violet, Xander, what are you doing? This isn't funny. Ursula's eyes filled with tears, unable to believe what her children had just done on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Violet stepped up to defend Xander and explain their objection to the guests. Most of you are probably wondering why Mom and David are getting married so soon and why they moved in together right after she split up with Dad. The truth is, they've been seeing each other for almost 2 years, even while Mom was still married to Dad. They're both cheaters. Mom cheated on Dad with David. David, is this true? David's parents asked, hurt and shocked. David didn't respond. He didn't even turn around. Around them, murmurs of disapproval began to spread. Quiet. Ursula hissed at Violet, panic beginning to take over. This was turning into a nightmare. Most of the guests had no idea about this. Neither she nor David had ever flaunted their affair. We hate David. He's the reason our parents split up, Xander continued. Our dad cried all the time because Mom was with David. We had to live with them while Mom was seeing David, and then she forced him on us. We don't want David to marry Mom, we don't want him to be our stepdad, we don't want to live with him, and we don't even want to know him. Mom, if you marry David, we're going to live with Dad. Violet practically growled at her mother. Violet, what are you talking about? Please, don't do this, Ursula pleaded with her children. Turning to David, she begged, give me a minute. I'll talk to them and put an end to this." David shook his head and, almost calmly, said to his bride, "Hell no. I'm done. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life dealing with this rudeness from these little brats. They don't like me, and they never will. And you know what? I don't like them either. I've wasted too much time and a damn fortune on them, and all I've gotten is disrespect. I'll marry you, but only if you live with me, and not with them." Ursula fell silent and looked at David in a way that made it clear she could never do what he was asking. "I figured," David muttered as he headed toward the exit. Desperately, Ursula grabbed his arm. "David, we can fix this." "No, we can't fix this, because there's nothing to fix. This is just the reality of the situation." David walked out of the chapel. Ursula burst into tears. Black streaks from her mascara ran down her face. She froze, watching her fiancé walk out of her life. Why did you do this to me?" she cried, heartbroken. To her children, "We hate you for what you did to Dad," Xander replied coldly. "You made us live with the guy you cheated on Dad with. Who does that?" Violet asked, her face filled with anger. "You made Dad's life, and ours, a nightmare." It was as if a moment of clarity pierced through Ursula. All the time she had been with David, she had never considered how it might affect the children. She had been so sure they would come to love David. But they never did, and they never would. She had forever damaged her relationship with the two people she loved more than anything, and they might never love her again. Ursula just stared at the children, then collapsed to the floor, sobbing, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I never imagined you felt this way. I never thought it would turn out like this. I love you. Please, I love you," she said, reaching out, pleading, in the now empty chapel. Violet and Xander didn't approach their mother. Their brows were furrowed, and they too looked upset. Their plan had achieved what they wanted, but they likely hadn't expected to see their mother turned into a pathetic, broken figure, lying before them. "Violet, do you have a phone?" her grandmother, Ursula's mother, asked gently. Violet nodded and opened her purse to show her grandmother. "You and Xander, go back to your rooms and change. Call your father and ask him to pick you up. You'll need to stay with him for a while." "But what about Mom?" Violet asked, concerned. "Don't worry about your mother. We'll take care of her. I'll call your father tonight and explain what happened. You can see her in a few days, once she's calmed down." Ursula's father gently helped his daughter up from the floor and led her out of the chapel. She kept glancing back at her children, who stood there looking somewhat stunned. Their grandmother hugged them tightly. "There's no need to apologize. Your grandfather and I never liked David either, nor what your mother did to Gary. The consequences are becoming clear now, and they will weigh heavily on her. In the long run, this will be for the best, but right now it's difficult. She'll need to earn your forgiveness, and she must understand that she brought this on herself. She'll also need to rebuild a cordial relationship with Gary and learn to respect him again as the father of her children. She's done something terrible, and I doubt he'll ever truly forgive her. Ursula has a long road of healing and learning ahead of her. It may take years of therapy. I love you, Violet. I love you, Xander. Don't worry, everything will be all right. Your grandfather and I will always be here for you. Now, let's go home." The children, along with their grandmother, left the scene of their mother's emotional undoing without looking back.